Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. I am Dr. Amanda Shi. I'm an anesthesiologist and intensivist. And today I want to talk about dealing with negative feedback or constructive criticism, which is something that we or any of us are going to get anytime throughout our careers and our lifetime, especially those of us that are going into fields or areas where there's a really long school or path for training to get to there. There's a lot of different steps in which you would be getting feedback. And in the workplace, it's really important to be able to listen to feedback and be able to take constructive criticism in order to continue to improve and be able to advance in your career. But that all being said, in this video, I kind of want to go into this topic in two different parts. So in the first part, I wanted to talk about some of the tips that I was thinking about to be able to kind of deal with, digest the feedback that you get or constructive criticism. And the second part, I wanted to go over a few examples of feedback that I have received along the way in my career and kind of how it either shaped me or how I thought about it and how I kind of dealt with it. So let's dive in. So let's start with the part of tips for dealing with feedback. The first tip I have is to make sure that you're in the right headspace to be able to digest the feedback. So that means that if you're already in a moment or a time when you're feeling really low or that you had a really stressful week, that's probably not the time to be reviewing the feedback that you're getting, because at the end of the day, you're not really sure what kind of things you're going to be getting. So while some things may make you feel better, I'm sure many of you guys have experienced that anytime you get any little piece of negative feedback or criticism, that it really stings and it sticks with you. So I think it's really, really important to recognize, to ask yourself and reflect, is this the right time to be opening this feedback? Is this the right time for me to be able to digest this? Or is there a better time where I could respond to the feedback in my mind in a constructive way as opposed to a deconstructive way? So I certainly am someone that takes feedback very, very, very personally. I will tell you that this video was actually inspired because as a faculty that teaches learners, I constantly am getting feedback about my teaching style, about how I interact with people. And while the vast majority of it is positive, any of the ones that are negative never fail to hurt. I mean, that's kind of the easiest way to describe it. It stings, it hurts, it sticks with you, it makes you doubt yourself, it makes you wonder, hey, like, why am I doing this? Or what is the point of this? It's kind of makes you go down this like negative spiral. And I'll say that this most recent time when I had gotten a feedback package and was able to review it, I wish that I had the advice that I'm giving right now about tips to be able to manage it. So what I'd say is that this most recent feedback that I received, I didn't really make sure I was in a good headspace for it. Ultimately, it ended up that it was a good enough time and I kind of have different coping mechanisms to be able to handle whatever negative feedback comes my way. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't still hurt. So that was something that I think is really important to be able to consider is number one, is this the right time for you to be reviewing or thinking about feedback? The second thing I wanted to point out was that it is so easy to forget about any of the positive things that are said about you. So for example, I at some point in my feedback reports have gotten a list of comments that range from positive to negative, and ultimately, I'll say that I barely kind of pay attention to some of the positives, but thinking back now, like those are really nice things to be able to remind yourself, hey, these are some of the things I'm doing really well, and I should keep focusing on trying to build on that and continue that and bring that kind of energy forward when I'm working with different people in my education role, in my administrative role, in my clinical role, et cetera, et cetera. So it is really important also to be able to digest and pat yourself on the back for positive feedback, because I think that that's something that a lot of us forget about. I certainly am guilty of this. Anytime I get feedback, I just am like totally tunnel vision on anything negative that is said and how I can get better and how I can change and make sure that that never happens again. But the reality is there's no perfect person, and so it's important to be able to balance things. So in my mind, I'd say that the scales are tipped way too much on the negative side, and one of the things I'm going to be working on is saying, okay, so yes, there are some things that I absolutely need to work on, but there's also these really sweet comments that are really positive, and there's certain things that I definitely am doing well, and I should be able to focus a lot of my energy on making sure that those traits and those things that I'm doing well continue on and get stronger. The third thing I wanted to go over was taking the feedback and thinking about what types of lessons or what types of actionable things you can gather from some of the feedback. So if something is kind of just attacking your overall personhood, I'd say some of that feedback may not be as constructive as other feedback where there's very specific actions or attitudes or responses that you can be thinking about working on and improving on in the future. So the thing I like to think about is to say, like, in the positive feedback side, okay, what are some of the things I'm doing really well? So that's a lesson to be able to say, I'm going to reinforce and continue to try to get better and try to make it so that those types of actions are more predominant compared to some of the negative comments I get, where if there's a certain response that I have or something where I definitely could have acted in a better way, to make sure to try to acknowledge that. And when I find myself in those situations again, remind myself that this is an opportunity to try to react differently or be able to improve on what I currently am doing, and then go from there. The fourth thing that I wanted to go over was a lesson that was given to me or was told to me by one of my professors in medical school was, while you should review all the feedback and the comments and things like that you've had, sometimes you should actually dismiss some of it. So this is actually something that I've been told twice before. In the second part, I'm gonna go over a specific instance where I had used this advice, but there was one time in medical school and one time in residency where I'd gotten some feedback, and I went to my mentors and I went to people that I really trusted and shared with them how it was really bothering me and how I wanted to be able to get better, but it felt like there wasn't a really easy way for me to be able to improve on it or a specific actionable item. And in those instances, the two people that I had gone to had both said similar things of, it's important to take all the feedback, so be able to read it all, digest it all, think about it, but then sometimes to recognize that feedback involves two different people usually. So if you're getting individualized feedback from one person, then that's two people. And everyone is in their different headspace. So personally, I would say that I myself, when I give feedback, I try to make sure that it is direct and in person and in real time. So if I see something, I will say something essentially. It's really hard to do because I hate trying to highlight things that could be better. But at the same time, the only way we can get better in our jobs and the work we do and to be able to make sure that we are safely taking care of patients is to constantly be improving on it and looking for ways that we can get better, and to have an outside set of eyes be able to identify those things, I think is really important and a big part of training. And so as a result, that's my personal way of feedback, but not everyone feels comfortable with that, especially when you're in a position where you may be the one being evaluated. So like when I was a trainee or a student, I myself didn't necessarily give direct feedback to my superiors about things that I felt like could be better because I didn't feel like I was in a position to do that. I think that that's really a sad kind of place to be in. That is a reality in a lot of situations, but also I would comment that there's definitely a lot of people that are champions for learners or for people that are not necessarily in a quote unquote position of power. And it's important to be able to find those individuals that you can trust, that you can get really unbiased feedback from, that you could also be able to share some of the concerns or things that could get better so that maybe they could work that into the system and be able to improve the system overall. So that's the tip about just think about things big picture. And sometimes there's some comments or feedback or criticisms that actually are not warranted and you can move on from them. So in this second part, I also wanted to go over 3 instances where I myself had gotten really negative feedback that stuck with me, that really impacted me, that really kind of hurt me. I'm not gonna lie with that. And how I moved forward from them or what lessons I kind of took from them. So the first instance was in undergrad when I was working with a researcher, and at the conclusion of the work that we were doing together, I was told pretty frankly that I probably wouldn't make it to medical school, or I wasn't going to get to medical school. That was at least my interpretation, or what I took home from it, was that I wasn't going to make it. So I had told this principal investigator or PI that I was interested in medical school, I was interested in a career in medicine, and the response I had gotten was very negative in that regard, that they didn't think that I would make it. So one thing I'd say about it is that definitely stuck with me, because clearly decade plus later, I am thinking about it now, and I think about the fact that it really kind of brought me down. It did make me doubt myself. I thought that this was someone that I could respect and that their opinion mattered a lot. And it's really unfortunate that this is the situation I was in, because I wonder what it would have been like to feel like I was supported and that I had someone that was an ally that was rooting for me, rather than someone that was telling me that I wasn't gonna make it. On one hand, it's probably a good thing that I had this experience to feel like I could prove someone wrong. But on the other hand, I don't think that that's valuable. I think that in my mind, I personally, when I'm trying to mentor people, I try to be realistic. So I'm never gonna say never. I'm never gonna say, I don't think you're gonna make this, but I am gonna be realistic about, I'm concerned about X, Y, or Z things happening, and here are some ways that I think we can make it better. But obviously there's no crystal ball, and we never can predict one thing or another. And a lot of, at least in medicine, the training, being able to match into things, getting to certain places, there's some randomness involved, and there's some luck involved. So never really shooting someone's dream down is kind of my way of thinking about things when I try to mentor people. But like I said, there's also a realistic component of it. So what would have been more helpful in that situation as an undergrad would have been to get the feedback of, I'm concerned that you may not be a good fit for medicine because of X, Y, or Z things that I had seen. Are those things you're working on? Do you need help with that? I think those are the things that actually matter and are helpful pieces of feedback or constructive criticism. So with that first one, I'd say it stuck with me. Probably on some level, it motivated me to prove them wrong. And it also shaped the way that I think about how I mentor people today. And so I try not to be that person. If you are ever being mentored by me or get advice from me and you feel like I'm being that person, I would love for you to call me out on that, because I think that it's important to recognize things like that. The second instance that I had gotten some feedback that really stuck with me was during one of my rotations. Surprisingly, this was a rotation in medical school that I, at one point, was thinking about pursuing that specialty in. So I went into it really excited about it. I'm really passionate about that field. I still am today, but ultimately what I'd say is that it was not a good fit for me in a personality standpoint, and I definitely started off on the wrong foot. So one thing that I am very aware of myself is that oftentimes my mouth goes on before my brain catches up, and so I certainly need to do better on just like stopping for a moment, not letting myself continue to talk on and on and on, and say kind of what's on my mind. I think a lot of people that know me very well feel that this is a strength of mine, that I'm very honest with people. I try not to say it in a mean way. I try not to, this isn't meant to be malignant or antagonistic when I'm saying something that I see or that I consider to be a fact of some sort, of some reality. And so a lot of people do appreciate my honesty, but sometimes my honesty can be taken in a lot of different contexts. So I would say in this particular rotation, I actually almost failed it. So those of you who don't know, in clinical rotations in medical school, it's usually comprised of two components. One component is like a test-based thing, so your knowledge, and the other component is a subjective feedback component, where basically all the people you're working with, like your residents, your fellows, your attendings that you're working with as a medical student, are gonna give feedback and literally like grade you on a scale of like, how well did you do this, or how poorly did you do this? And then they combine all of that into a cumulative score, and the clerkship director usually then decides, okay, this warrants a passing grade or sometimes an honors grade, depending on what type of medical school you're in and how they do evaluations and grading or not. So in my particular instance, I actually almost failed that component of things because I had gotten such negative feedback from the people I worked with. And what was really, I will never forget the moment when I had gotten the mid-rotation kind of sit down meeting where they were trying to give me the feedback, and it just felt like I was being attacked. It was just like multiple people. It's amazing actually that I didn't just burst into tears, because I was sitting there with people that I'd say I respected, these are residents and attendings, that were just telling me all of these horrible things that they wanted to say about me or about how I was acting during this rotation. And so I took the feedback, and essentially, I hate to say that I tried to play the game of saying nothing most of the time, and just kind of kept my head down and followed through on some of the very specific action items that were said. And then eventually I passed that rotation. But I would say that it still lingers to this day, this thought of like some of the things that were said during that time, like how is it possible that there are individuals that would hate a student or go against a student so much that they would even go as far to potentially almost fail someone. I don't know. I would say that people who make it into medical school oftentimes are really smart people. We all have some interesting personalities. I would argue that anyone that goes through this path, we all have our weirdness, our weird ways, in our unique weird ways, and we all have interesting personalities in one way or another. But that being said, there's a lot of different personalities that may or may not clash, and ultimately, I'm not sure in that instance if that was beneficial for me. I think that all it did was really sour me on the culture of that particular specialty. It continues to kind of sour me in that time, but what did happen was after I had gotten the written feedback from that rotation, I actually reached out to one of the deans and just wanted to ask for advice. And I thought that that was something that really stuck with me to this day. And actually I use the same type of thing in residency. Was when I get specific feedback, I try to digest it, but then I try to reach out to mentors to see from another set of eyes, is there something else that I can take away from this or think about? And that was when I had gotten the advice that some feedback should just be left alone, dismissed, kind of forgotten about, and moving on from there. So I'd say that that was a very, very negative moment, a very dark time in my clinical year. I will say that that particular specialty was then a couple months followed by anesthesia, and I immediately was like, I found my people. These are the personalities I want to be with. These are the individuals that are always kind of team players, that always want to help each other. And it totally made me appreciate that there are different personalities that exist in different specialties, and I had picked a specialty that really works well with my personality. So anyway, that was the second time that I had gotten really, really negative feedback that has stuck with me to this day. And then finally, the more recent example of feedback I've gotten is now that I'm an attending. So there's a lot of different jobs out there for anesthesiologists. So I'd say that there's two main divides or two main categories of jobs. One category of job is to be in kind of an academic setting working with learners versus the private practice setting where typically there are not that many students, or there's no students that you work with at all, or trainees, residents, fellows, that type of thing. So private practice, though there's some private practices that will take students here and there if they're associated with a medical school or a student creates their own rotation there. But generally speaking, if you're in the private practice realm or purely private practice group, then you'll be not working with trainees or learners. And if you're in an academic place, you're certainly going to be working with trainees and learners. So one of the things in the academic sphere is that I give my residents feedback and my residents give me feedback, or fellows as well. And my approach to this is typically that, as I had said earlier, or alluded to earlier, is that I never want someone to be surprised by anything I write in my feedback. I want to make sure to sit down with someone or have one-on-one time with them to be able to speak to specific instances that I saw that someone could be doing better, or how I interpreted that particular instance. And I hope to do it in a safe enough environment that they feel like they can respond in some way, or they can digest it, or that hopefully it's not in an intimidating way. But as an aside, it's very interesting now that I personally feel like I'm not a very intimidating individual, but I also recognize as an attending, as someone that is writing evals and has some random titles here and there, that I'm not in the same position that I was when I first graduated and many of the residents had known me as a fellow or known me as a resident. So I'm in a different era in my career, and so I need to acknowledge that there is going to be some probable intimidation level, even though I try my best to not be an intimidating person, or to be someone at least that students, learners can come to and be able to be honest with, so that we can work together and get them through whatever issue they're going through, or just to be a sounding board for people too. So I strive for that. Obviously, no one is perfect and I cannot achieve some perfect level there. So that all being said, the most recent thing in the last few years as being an attending has been trying to figure out how to handle the written feedback that I get from residents. So each day I try, most of the time, especially if there's a moment to kind of breathe and reflect and debrief, I try to get feedback, elicit feedback from my residents the day of, to hear, you know, what are some things that I did well for them? What are some things that I could work on and do better? The flip side is there are some days that are stressful for residents and fellows, and they're also stressful for me as an attending. So both parties may not be in the best mindset to be able to articulate feedback or articulate what went well and what didn't go as well in a collaborative and in a very supportive and warm manner. So I am not immune to the stress and to being in kind of a bad mood if things are really rough that day. So I take a lot of pride in my work. I care deeply about making sure patients get the best quality care, the safest care. And sometimes there are scenarios, because I take care of a lot of really sick patients and the staffing is set up in such a way that I don't feel like I'm doing my best. And when that happens, I'll say that I know that my outwardly bubbliness and personality may not be what it normally is at the end of the day. So there are definitely times where I acknowledge that I'm not my best self, and I think that those are times where it can be pointed out in some of my feedback forms that those are things that I need to work on. So the challenge that has come up, I would say, and I'm constantly still working on this, I would love if you guys had some additional ideas that you could share on how you manage this, but at this point, I'm still in a phase where every time I read this feedback or every time I go through this report and I see some of these negative comments, I try my best to follow my own advice, but it still makes me question my own skills as a teacher, as a faculty member, as a clinician, as an anesthesiologist, as an intensivist. There's so many things that it makes me question myself on, and ultimately it ends up grading on me and sticking with me, and just it adds to some level of insecurity, even though I have gotten indicators in other ways to say that these areas are things that I'm pretty good at. I'm not in a remediation plan. I'm not in an area that I've been identified that I have a lot of things that I absolutely need to work on. So that's where I'm at right now, is what I'll say, is like still a work in progress to figure out how I'm going to deal with kind of the feedback I get as a faculty member. Personally, I wish that individuals would feel safe enough or feel comfortable enough to say things directly to my face rather than through anonymous channels. But I also recognize why that would be uncomfortable, or why no one would probably choose that as their first choice for it. But still a work in progress. I think that that's something that I would love if you have ways that you have managed feedback as someone who is a teacher or faculty member. And how do you take what you need from it and be able to improve? And how do you know what are some things that perhaps it's better to just try to move on from? So anyway, that was my two-part video on feedback, well, negative feedback and constructive criticism. I hope that this was helpful to you, or at least interesting in some way. Thank you for watching all the way up until this point. If you like this video, please give me a thumbs up. And if you like listening to me talk, then please subscribe to my channel. I will see you guys next time.